Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about a really important topic, which is how do we actually deal with deploying forms to websites where responsive considerations are important. And I say that with almost some trepidation because I think every site has responsive considerations now. We live in multiple device worlds where somebody can be accessing our site and our forums from just about any type of device, from a small watch to a full desktop. And so having the ability to deal with some of the technical difficulties that may arise from those situations is important. What's key about this, though, is there is no, at this time, silver bullet solution. Depending on the site layout, where you're going to deploy your forms, you may have several different considerations that you need to look at in order for your forms to display properly. Now, luckily, I do have a couple common examples right here, and I think from these three examples, you'll have a pretty good handle on being able to deploy forms properly across a wide variety, if not the majority, of viewing situations that you'll have. So let's kind of dive right in. So I've got three examples as noted. The first one is a very simple layout. So this is more just to kind of get our bearings here to see what this looks like. So first things first, let me actually undo responsive mode. So one thing that really helps when you're designing for responsive devices is to be able to see very quickly if your content is acting responsively. And a nice shortcut that all major browsers have now is something called Responsive Design View. Now in Firefox, which I usually use, it's actually a very simple shortcut. If you're on a Mac, it's Option-Command-M, and you get something that looks like this. If you're more of a menu person, you go into a little hamburger menu here, go to Developer, and then Responsive Design View. And of course, the other major browsers have their own version of this. The core feature here, though, is actually quite simple. We simply have a drop-down in Firefox's version where we can actually select a screen size and it'll resize our screen appropriately. We can do things like rotate, simulate touch events, and so on. But for right now, we're just going to kind of concern ourselves with the size that we get from right here. So what are we actually looking at? Well, the basic idea here is I have a form that appears to be resizing properly. And so it is worth spending just a second here to talk about how we did that within Rack Forms, because by default, when we build a form in Rack Forms, it's not going to act responsively. So the good news is to make a form responsive in Rack Forms is actually quite simple. It's usually a single click or a two-step process, depending on how you want to do it. If you're into the single click thing, you can just simply select the page that you want to make responsive by clicking its header. You scroll down to Form Style Properties and click this button right here, Make this page responsive. What that's going to essentially do is the two steps for us. The first is it's going to make our page width 100%. So traditionally, when we build a page in Rack Forms, it has a set pixel width. But when we do this, it overrides that. It just makes everything 100%. That's how we get it so that our form always takes up 100% of the available page width. However, we still need to make sure that our fields are 100%. And so if we click this button, it'll do that automatically for us, or we can manually go in and select individual fields and say, here is your specific field width. Now, generally speaking, we don't want to make field widths 100%. We want to make them between 95 and 98%. So that we get a nice look to it where it's not taking up the entire page width here, but if we scale down to phone size, it appropriately has margins on both sides. Okay, so that's what we do in Rack Forms. Now let's get to the potential problems. So if we look right here, you can see here that resize works, but not if it's too small. So let's start to take a look at some of the pitfalls and concerns that we're going to have when we start doing extreme resizing. Now, in this case, you're going to notice here that when I hit this block of text right here, something is going to happen. This guy is going to stay put, but you're going to notice the submit button is going to start a slow march down towards where this is. So watch what happens here. So notice my text broke down into a second line, and so my submit button started to move down as well. And notice here that as we get more lines to this text, the further this thing down is going to go. So notice it keeps moving down, and you can kind of see what's going to happen next here when we go even smaller than this, which, by the way, is smaller than any cell phone screen, but may, if, let's say, somebody's on a watch and watches support browsing the web in a couple of years, this will certainly be a problem. Watch what happens here. We're eventually just going to lose the submit button altogether. Now, I don't want to belabor this point too much, but it is important to note here that the reason why the submit button goes away is for a problem that we're about to fix, but why it happens in the form is because this text right here is being like fluid, and as it gets more lines, it's taking up more space, and that space then is coming at the cost of the bottom of our form. So the submit button keeps getting pushed down, but the iframe, that is the container of this form, is not actually resizing. And so because it's not resizing, the submit button just goes bye-bye. Now, it is really important to note here, I don't want to belabor this too much, but it's really important to note that this is a simplified version, or let's say a less extreme version, of how resizing a form in a responsive view can cause items to move down. If we had more helper text right here, so that we're getting more items that we're breaking into multiple lines, this submit button could have gone bye-bye by right now, right? Like we could have had so many lines of text wrapping in on each other that it just would have pushed it off. So in other words, your mileage may vary here, where this may be a more pronounced effect. Anyway, without belaboring the point anymore, how do we actually fix that? Well, the solution for this may appear at first to be, well, let's just make the iframe height 100%. So maybe we're actually going to go to the source code of the page, and by the way, this is it. I told you it was simple. And maybe we'd be tempted to do something like this. Maybe I'd say, well, what if I make the height 100%? And you know what? That actually does work. Let's go ahead and resize this, right? So the submit button is gone, and I'm just going to refresh the page right now. And yeah, sure enough, the submit button is now showing, because now the iframe is just taking up 100% of the page width. But there's a problem. Look what I did to this guy right down here. So this is not actually a solution, it turns out, because all we've done here is we've just said the iframe should take up 100% of the page height, the entire page height. Well, we clearly don't want that, because now we have this huge space under here where maybe this is some really important information that we want to show. So unfortunately, that is not a solution. The solution, as it turns out, is actually to use a script that ships with rack forms called resizeiframes.js. So what Resize iframes.js does, and by the way, we're referencing this one right here, but if you want to use the one that we traditionally ship with rack forms, you can use under scripting iframes. You can grab it from right here as well. But essentially what this script does for us is it's actually going to take the iframe, it's going to inspect its height to see how tall everything is, and it's going to resize the iframe based on that. So now when I refresh the page, notice what happens right here already. This content in the form is already much closer to where it should be, and more importantly, when we actually resize this guy, not only is that submit button always going to remain visible, this guy right here is not going to be thrown all the way down to the bottom of the page. So that is the solution, is to simply include your iframe onto the page, place the resize-iframes.js script somewhere where it can be accessed by the parent page, and then our resize problem goes away. Now, that said, that is one possibility for issues. There is another class of issues that can come up, and it's much more common in slightly more advanced layouts. So here I have iframe media. Let's go ahead and load up this one here. And now you can see that I have this slightly more complicated layout, which is where we have this line right here is the left floating div. Then we have our content, which is the middle block, which is in this case our iframe. You can see that right here. And notice, by the way, we started at 400 pixels and we ended at 1,000. So the width is indeed 600 pixels. Got this nice little grid here. We can kind of confirm this. And then finally, we have our right div right here, which is then just basically a div that goes after the form. Now, this is going to be much more common in terms of like a real world layout. Most websites that you visit are not just going to be a single wide div, right, that just resize like this. They're actually going to be things like this. And so here we have a second class of problem that comes up. So you're going to actually notice now that we're going to have, in this case now, two problems. So the first problem here is that when I actually start hitting where my form is, notice my form fields are not actually resizing properly at all. Even though the form, this is by the way the same form as we had right here, even though the form is set to use 100% page width and the fields are, they're not actually resizing along with the rest of the content right here. So why is that? Well, it turns out the reason why is because of the parent layout that this form finds itself in. Specifically, the middle column here has a set specific width of 600 pixels. And so what that's actually doing to us then is that's saying that this form is using 100% of 600 pixels, no matter what we do. And so what we actually want to have happen here is we want to include a media query. Now, this isn't really the video to learn about media queries extensively, but I will give a quick primer here. What a media query basically is doing for us, and this is one right here, is basically saying if our media is the screen, and by the way, other types of media can be like print, if we're going to have a different print CSS class, but we're basically saying if the media is screen and our max width is, in this case, 558 pixels, we're going to apply this style to the middle column right here. So right now, if we're over 558 pixels, our width is going to be 600 pixels. But if we're under 558 pixels, then we're essentially going to say that our middle is 100%. And now if I refresh this, notice what happens here. As soon as I hit 558 pixels, oops, make sure I refresh this, make sure I save that. When I hit 558 pixels, notice now that, oops, we snap over. Notice how just that little difference, it snaps over, and then our form starts resizing appropriately. So that is the solution for that. If you ever find yourself in a place where your form is not resizing, it's because you probably are in a layout where the width of the column that the form is in is actually set to a specific pixel width. By using a media query, though, we can retain our original layout, which works perfectly fine for desktops, but we actually get the benefit then of resizing when we're on smaller devices. However, this is still not done yet because we have our original problem coming back now, which is we're losing our submit button. And of course, the fix for that, again, is to simply make sure that we have resize iframes.js so that when I resize this, it automatically resizes the iframe to accept all content. Okay, let's take a look at one more example, and this is by far the most, quote, real-world example. We're going to take a look at the resizing issues, but I also want to take a look at another potential issue, which you might actually see if you're doing a lot of testing. So a lot of times when you're learning about responsive design, you're just creating really simple HTML pages, and you might do something like this. You're going to load up your thing, that is your location where it is, and you're just going to double click on the index page. And hey, I've got my resize iframe script running. So let's actually take a look at this code right here. So I've got resize iframes running. Everything looks good, but it doesn't actually work. So let me go ahead and resize right here. And you can see that there is definitely something wrong here. My submit button is getting cut off. But you're saying, well, everything looks fine. I'm including resize iframe.js. Like nothing else is different. Well, it turns out a very common thing that even happens to me is we have a cross-site restriction occurring here. And so what happened was the source of the error was when I loaded up this page, I didn't actually do so through the web server. I actually just double-clicked it and loaded it from the file system. So notice our address bar here has file ://. And what that basically means is that when Firefox renders this page, or Chrome, or Edge, or whatever your common browser is, it's actually going in here and it's saying, right, the domain that this is running from is like a local file domain. But, and this is absolutely imperative, the actual iframe is running from a web server, which in this case is dev. And so what's actually happening now is when this form loads, we're actually getting an error right here that we can see right here. So permission denied to access property document. And you'll actually see here that this is where it's coming from, is our resize-iframes.js file. The reason why this is happening is because resize iframes is looking at the iframe, this guy right here, and it's saying you're coming from a different location than where the actual parent page is loaded from. I know this is super esoteric, but it's really important to understand this, that if you are, for example, deploying a form to a customer site, and maybe your customer is on example.com, and your site, where you're actually hosting the form from, is, let's say, abc.com, this resize iframe script will not actually work by default. I think there are workarounds for this where you can actually flag some domains as being safe, but I wouldn't even mess with that. Basically what the problem is that JavaScript cannot talk from one iframe from a parent to its child, that is where the iframe is to the outside world, if the domains are different. And of course, if you think about this, that's a very good thing. If you're on a Facebook login form and it's on some website that you maybe trust, but maybe not. You would certainly not want the parent page where the iframe for the Facebook login is contained to be able to access the login fields, because you could just steal your Facebook password if they did that. So browsers restrict that for a very good reason, but as form developers, it also means that we will get bit by this if we're trying to deploy forms using Resize iframes.js that are on different domains. If that is the case, instead of hosting the form from your web server, you're going to have to give it to your client and make sure that both the form and the Resize iframes JavaScript script are on the same domain. Now, that said, as long as we do that, and by the way, here now, instead of loading it from file, I simply loaded it from the web server. As soon as we do that, the error actually goes away. And notice I haven't changed anything about the page. Everything now should just work. So I've included the resize script on my page, so my iframe is always appropriately sized, and in this case, it's in a much more complex layout. So in other words, this Resize iframes JS script is not just for the simple stuff, it can do all sorts of really complex layouts like this. So as way of brief summary then, the first step when we're working with responsive forms is to always make sure in rack forms that we've done one of two steps. We've selected the page and just clicked make this page responsive for every page that we want responsive, or if we didn't do that, make sure that we manually check the box all content uses 100% of available page width. This will make the width of the page 100%, and then manually go in and adjust the field widths of all items that you want to something that makes sense for that form. That's step one. Step two then, just by using our simple example right here, is to make sure that when we paste in the embed iframe code, that we place the Resize iframes.js script on the same server as where our parent page is located. So long as we do that, we should automatically get a beautifully resizing page that always shows all content. However, there is one final gotcha that can hit us, and that is if the parent page that we're on is using a fixed width for the location of the script. And again, as we saw right here, if that happens, we need to add a media query so that the content within this smaller area is going to resize appropriately. Now, that said, if you've downloaded a template like I did for this one right here, that should almost never be a problem. You should not have to add that style yourself, because if you did, there'd be something much more wrong with the template that you're using. So if you've downloaded a template or you bought one, you should not have to do that step. However, if you're building your own template, you are absolutely going to have to do that. So I figured I'd throw that piece of advice in just in case you had your own custom-built website and you couldn't quite get it to work. Okay, so I shall leave it at that. Hopefully this has been useful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please let us know at info@rackforms.com, and thanks for watching.